So now that you learned how to calculate GDP, I want you to understand why trends, charts over time with GDP can be deceiving. Let's dive in. So you've learned how to calculate GDP and you see this graph with trends of GDP over time. I'm going to tell you that sometimes that graph makes sense and sometimes it could be deceiving. And the time it could be deceiving is if GDP is calculated in the basic form that we've learned so far, which is nominal GDP, just adding up the value of all goods and services produced in a given year. Why is that deceiving? Well, you can have a GDP that starts at so many $billion, and in the following year, it's 10% higher than the previous year. And you can think, wow, that's great. The economy has grown by 10% from one year to the next. But that is actually false. When GDP grows from one year to the next, it's growing based on two reasons. Two things will grow GDP. One, either there's a growth in production, the amount of goods being produced, or two, there's a growth in the price of those goods. Obviously, it could be a combination of the two, and that's typically the case, but you could have the two extremes as well. So going from, let's say, $2 to $2.2 billion could simply just be because all of the goods in the economy have gone up by 10% in price. And we produced the same thing as last year, but now it's worth 2.2 billion instead of 2 billion. So no change. So seeing that graph and seeing a trend over time and seeing how fast GDP is growing over time is a falsehood. It's exaggerating reality. So you want to try to extract that inflation influence. And that's why real GDP has been created. So real GDP looks at a long period of time, or it could just be a few years. What it does is it takes the prices of a base year and it uses those prices to calculate the value of what's being produced in all of those years. So let's say you're looking from 1980 to 2000. Well, you could say we're going to use 1990 prices. Could also be 1980 or 2000. There's different reasons for using different prices, but you use the same prices all the way through. So that means that if you see this trend that GDP is going up, well, at least you know that that's purely based on an increase in production. And that's the interesting part, because we want to know how the economy is doing, how it's growing, not just how it's being inflated by higher prices. So that's what you'll often notice in those graphs that you want to pay attention to. They're going to often use the word real GDP, and they're going to talk about a base year prices to say we're using the prices of that year. In calculation, nominal and real GDP will be equal to one another when we're looking at the base year as being the year being looked at. So if we say 2000 is our base year, well, in 2000, nominal and real GDP are the same because you're using the quantities in both cases, but you're also using the price of year 2000 in both cases. Whereas in 2001, nominal and real will be different because the nominal will be using prices of 2001 with the quantities of 2001, whereas the real will still use the quantities of 2001, but with the prices of 2000. By looking at trends and real GDP over time, we can see how the economy is doing. And that's much more reflective of the economy as a whole. There is still a small thing that we have to consider in this whole story, and it's whether every human in that population in that country, it can be doing better from one year to the next. So the one thing that real GDP does not really take into account is population size. So you could start in a given year with a population of 20 million and then at the end have 40 million, but you're just looking at the value of production. So by not taking that into account, your real GDP will be growing from one year to the next, even if everyone produces the same quantity of goods, if there is more people through immigration or through births that lead to more people that can work and produce things. So we have to keep that in mind. Real GDP trends are good because it removes the inflation impact, but they're not complete because it doesn't take into account population size. So on that front, real GDP per capita is more interesting to look at on an individual basis from one year to the next. What has production done? Because it gives you an idea. Well, past generations, you could have maybe one car per household. Now we have several cars per household. Well, why is that? Well, because we're producing more value per individual that we used to in the past. One of the pitfalls of real GDP per capita is, though, that we're dividing real GDP by total population. So if from one year to the next, we have a massive baby boom and the amount of people that are actually working isn't changing, well, production probably won't change all that much. But because of this massive baby boom, the denominator for real GDP per capita is growing, and therefore real GDP per capita could actually fall. So you have to kind of look at if there's big shifts in total population and what portion of that population is not working. So it could either be baby booms, or when these baby booms in the past are all retiring all of a sudden, well, that's also going to lead to less workers, but the same population size, which will drop down real GDP per capita. You just have to understand what each metric does and what are some of the limitations and what can we use instead. And the reason why it's important to know that is that you'll often see articles of people that wrote it that everything sounds sophisticated, everything sounds good, but they're kind of playing with some of this information. I've seen situations where they show nominal GDP trends. And if you go through periods where they had really high inflation, like in the 70s and 80s, you could say, well, GDP was growing like crazy in those years. Well, you had over 10 to 20% inflation. Obviously, like if you just look at nominal GDP, it's going to grow a lot in that period of time. So hopefully you understand the different metrics out there, how each one kind of improves on certain things, but what are its limitations. Catch you on the next one. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real life examples. Have a good day.